Welcome back to the Blazor Server In-Depth course. In this lesson, we're looking at deploying to a local IIS. So IIS is Internet Information Server, and its job is to host websites. Okay, so we're going to deploy to a local IIS, meaning you can actually have, if you're running Windows, which you probably are, but if you're not, well, this is going to work for Windows. But if you're running Windows, you can actually install IIS on your Windows machine. So it's a full web server, and it will act like the server web server, but it's local. And so you can kind of play around it because it's the same IIS you'll see on a server somewhere. So this is going to simulate if you want to deploy to a remote server. It'll be the same process. So even if you are on a Mac, if you're looking to deploy to a remote Windows server, then this will work for you as well. Okay, so let's get started. Let's go to Visual Studio, and we're going to create a sample project in Blazor. We'll call it Blazor App, and we'll call this IIS Deploy Demo. And it's just going to be a sample project, simple, no authentication for now, HTTPS, everything's standard, and now we'll just make sure it runs and then we'll deploy it. Okay, because we're not actually worrying about configuring this. There's no reason to. We have to make sure that it works. Okay, so it is launching now. There's our simple standard Blazor web app. We're good to go. Okay, so let's just change one thing so we know that we've deployed a real one. It's not a trickery or something like that. Which I wouldn't do that to you, but let's go to the index page and say, hello from IIS. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to deploy this web app. Now, as I talked about, this IIS Express is simulating what IIS, the full Internet Information Server, will do. But a simulation is not always the same as the real thing. Plus, this is for us for development purposes. If you install IIS on your machine and make some tweaks to your firewall, you can actually host a web server off of your machine. And while that probably won't be good for actually hosting it on the internet, because you have to have a static IP address or you have to have a service that changes your IP address, and you have to have your computer on all the time, and it'd be messy, but it is a great thing for internal testing. So if you're running an IIS Express and you tell your buddy, hey, try us out, your buddy has to come over on your computer and run it. But if you deploy it to your local IIS and have your firewall open, you can send your buddy your IP address and say, hey, log in this IP address and check out the website. And they can do that from any computer on the same network or that has access to your computer. Okay? So some really powerful additional steps for development purposes. But this will also then work all the way into production, because the same thing we do for local, we can do to a remote IIS. And a remote IIS is typically an actual web server. So let's start with how do we get IIS on our machines. So if you go to, in Windows, Apps and Features, you'll see on the right-hand side, Programs and Features. Click that, and it's going to open up a list of programs and features. And this is like the old school uninstall programs page. But there's a link over here that says turn Windows features on or off. Click that, and it's going to pop up this little dialog right here. And this dialog has, here's the stuff that's installed, and here's the stuff you could install. For example, I've got Hyper-V installed because I use Docker. And that sets some things up for Docker. But down here, there's Internet Information Services. Check that box. It's going to black out like this. And the reason it blacks out is because it doesn't install everything. Like no FTP, and we're just getting the IIS Management Console, not the compatibility or the script tools or the services. This is all fine. The standard is fine. So just check the box, and that's all you need to do. Once you hit OK, it's going to install that in your computer, and you may need to reboot, but otherwise, you should be up and running. Okay, now I already have that installed, so I'm all set there. So now that you have that installed, you need to do one more thing. And I'm going to put this URL, maybe I'm going to copy it first and paste it into, let's go on the index page. And I'm going to paste it. You know what? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually link it where we have our, oops, not there, nav menu. There's the link, okay, in the main layout.razor. I'm going to change it from saying about to update IIS. Okay, and this link now will take you to the page you need to go to in order to update IIS. So if we run this, just to kind of show where it's going to be, in this demo, instead of the About page on the upper right-hand corner, you have Update IIS. You click that, it takes you right to the page. Okay? Now on this page is one thing that you need. If you scroll down, install the .NET Core Hosting Bundle. This is the first time you do this, you have to install the hosting bundle. So if you've already configured it once, you don't have to do it again if you're doing a new website. It's just one time per computer. That's all it is. So what you do is you click on this current .NET Core Hosting Bundle installer, which is a direct download, which means you click it, it's going to start downloading. Run that exe, okay? And that's going to be on the same computer that IIS is, which if you're doing this locally, like I'm showing you, then it'd be this computer. And once you're done, restart your computer, okay? Now you could, if you want to, if you don't want to restart, you could go to the command line and as an administrator and run netstop was/y, and then once it's done, net start w3 svc. Okay, that restarts the web server. But you don't have to do that. Just restart your computer. It'll do the same thing. You're good to go. It may be a little easier to do it that way. Okay, so once those two steps are done, you're ready to IIS. So I hit the Windows key and just type, I start typing internet, and internet information server is one of the options. Usually not the first one. The first one's usually Internet Explorer, but the second one should be Internet Information Services. So this is IIS. And yeah, it may look a little confusing, but don't worry, we'll get there. Under Sites, you'll probably have a default website, which we do. And if I hit Browse right now, it's going to open up this default website. Okay, so it's running. So we've got a website on localhost on HTTP, so it says not secured. And we could publish here and modify things. I don't prefer to do that. Instead, I prefer to create a new site for my server or for my application. So add website, and I call this my IIS, or let's call it Blazor demo. Okay, so it's going to create an application pool that is the same name. Now, an application pool has an identity associated with it, and that identity is who actually runs the web server. Usually it's IIS user, and you just need to make sure that your folder has given permissions to IIS user. So we'll look at that in a minute, but just note that's what the application pool name is. The physical path, I'm going to click the ellipsis here, and I'm going to go to D, Demos, and let's create a new folder here called Blazor Web App. Hit OK. That's my new path. Pass-through authentication is fine. And we're going to choose HTTPS. We want this to be secured. Okay? Now, that does mean it opens up down here an SSL certificate. Let's do a drop down here and say I want the IIS Express development certificate. Okay? Now, that does mean that if anybody else browses to this, they have to also trust your development certificate. But this allows you to get up and running without actually going to a certificate manager and creating a certificate that's trusted and installing it and all the rest. So if you're going to do this in production, you would change this to an actual certificate that you have on your machine for a specific URL. And speaking of which, the host name or the URL, we're going to choose localhost. Now you can't have more than one website using the same host name at the same port name. So if you're going to install a second Blazor demo, you're going to have to either change the port or change the host name. Okay? Probably the easiest is to change the port number. That just means that when you go to localhost, you have to go to localhost : and the new port number. That's really the big kicker there. But that's the simplest way of doing it. You can change your host name, and you can map a new host name and say, okay, well, test. Good thing. So now IIS is ready to be published to. So to publish it, what we're going to do is go back to our publish. We're going to choose that same location. So D, demos, Blazor web app. Again, you could choose a different location and then copy the files from that location into this folder. This is just a shortcut. Now we hit next. And we got to choose some custom profile settings. We want release mode. That's going to make sure that we've got all the development stuff cleaned out. We're not going to do development stuff. All right, so release. Target framework is .NET Core 3.1. And that's based upon what we're running right now. So that's what we built our web app in. Therefore, that's the target framework. Deployment mode right now is framework dependent. So what framework dependent means is you have to have .NET Core 3.1 installed on the host machine in order to run your website. That's framework dependent. If we chose self-contained, you would not have to have .NET Core 3.1 installed on the host machine in order for it to run. The difference is that self-contained brings the .NET Core 3.1 framework with the website. It makes it much larger, but it ensures that you don't have to have .NET Core 3.1 on the server. If you're doing this on a local IIS, you can do framework dependent because you know that it has .NET Core 3.1 because that's what you're developing in. But if you're deploying this to a server where you're not sure, try this first. If it doesn't work, then switch over to self-contained. Okay? Now, target runtime is portable, means it will figure out what the best runtime to use is. File publish options. Delete all existing files prior to publish. This cleans the directory out so that if you removed files, let's say you had a support PDF and you no longer use that support PDF. Well, if you do a publish and it overwrites all the files, but that support PDF So that's really it. That's how you publish to IIS. Now you may have the question of how do I publish a database with this? Let's say I have our SQL database from last series or last section where we built out that SQL database. How do we deploy that as well? And if you're deploying manually, like we are for this Blazor app, you would create a manual deployment for that database as well, which we already did. Remember that whenever we made a change to a store procedure, we had to publish it? Well, we would publish it to whatever database location you wanted. As far as the app settings.json goes, you would change that connection string for the published location and then publish. So if the database changed locations between development and publish, then you would have two different connection strings. Now here's the really cool thing. Let's just create a connection string. So connection strings, we'll say default, and this is my production connection string. Okay? So that's what's in app settings.json. But if you open up or expand this arrow and you see app settings.development.json, this file overwrites this file when you're in development mode. We've seen that. So in development, you could say this is my development connection string. Okay? And so in development, whenever you're running IIS Express or Kestrel, you will get this connection string. When you publish, because you publish in release mode, then you will get this connection string. So that's one way of doing it. And that's a way of doing it for local publishing or for kind of small time stuff. But if you have any kind of security on your local database for publishing to IIS, then you probably don't want to put it right in your app settings.json because of the fact that it will get put into source control and saved on a server. And then everybody has access to that. That's not a good idea. So instead what you can do is once you publish, if you're going to do this manually, because you really want to have a CI/CD pipeline, and that's where you would automatically do these replacements. And you'd pull from Azure Key Vault, or you would even have Azure pull it in itself, whatever you want. And I'll show you Azure in a couple of lessons and how to do that. But if you are publishing to your local IIS, but you want to have a more secure database connection, what you can do is once you publish, this is the publish location. There's app settings.json. This is a text file. So you can right click and edit that in Notepad or something else, and you can put your own connection strings like so. And you can say default and say this is my secret connection string. Like so. And just make sure you get your formatting right. Okay, so that's how you would set it up right on disk. So now this has a secret connection string, which yes, you can still access it via text file, but again, if someone has access to your web server, they already have access to your full application, you're already in trouble. So this is a way of doing that manually. Now, again, you want to do this in an automated fashion, and that's where continuous integration, continuous deployment come in, where during that deployment process, you're swapping out your connection string for the real connection string. During CI/CD, you can also automatically deploy your server, so your database server. So if you have one database or two databases, you have Entity Framework database for identity, and you have your SSDT database, you can deploy both of those to a location and then update the connection strings appropriately. So this is more for development purposes or for low-end production work. So if you're not deploying very often, or if you're a very small shop and you don't have a whole lot of time, then this right-click publish will work. But this is usually just for testing purposes, for development purposes, where you're testing against a real IIS server, but it's not something customers are seeing, and it's not something you have to rely on. Okay? So it's a few steps in the process instead of what a CI/CD process is, which is automated, but it gets the job done. All right? So that's IIS deployment. Once you get IIS configured, there's not much to it. It's just right-click publish, and then in your publish settings, you say, hey, go to this location, put the files there, and you're good to go. Okay? Try that out, give it a shot, see how it works on your machine. And if you don't have IIS locally, you can use things like Azure. You can create an Azure VM that has IIS and publish it to that. Or you can just move on to the next step where we deploy again, but to a different location.